Nikola Tesla was declared dead in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel on January 7, 1943. That statement became the accepted record, a tidy conclusion to a life of electric revelations and public spectacle. Yet, the events that followed felt less like closure and more like a cover when a genius who once made light dance in the air is removed from the public square with the sudden secrecy and rapid confiscation. Questions do not go away. They echo. Some believe that the official story was a curtain dropped over something far more complicated. In the months before that January morning, Tesla had grown increasingly private, living in a small suite under the constant hum of city life. He received visitors in short, guarded conversations, then returned to his notebooks and machines. Staff at the hotel later described odd hours, bursts of static in the corridors, and the inventor's insistence that his work must not be disturbed. There was about him a sense of urgency that baffled those who had watched him decline from celebrity to recluse. To those who study disappearances, urgency combined with secrecy is often a prelude to deliberate disappearance rather than natural decline. The discovery of his body was followed by a wave of official action that seemed calibrated to erase more than to explain. Agents moved into the room quickly. Sealed trunks were removed. Documents were boxed and taken away, and a government office ordinarily tasked with foreign property became involved. The speed and intensity of that response read like an emergency protocol, more fit for state secrets than for the estate of a retired inventor. For a man whose life work revolved around unseen forces, the removal of his papers felt like a sweep of light, clearing a stage after a final performance. Friends and family were kept at arm's length. Nephew later recounted oddities in the inventory in the sense that not everything had been recorded. There were reports of boxes that were never logged and a safe that was found empty. The lack of public photographs of the body and the swift cremation left even those who mourned him with an unsettled impression. It is the pattern of many famous disappearances to substitute speed for scrutiny. In that haste, doubt finds footholds and conspiracies take root. Tesla had long entertained ideas that unsettled the comfortable walls of scientific consensus. He spoke often in metaphors about frequencies and resonance and wrote of devices that could transmit power across continents. He also hinted at mechanisms capable of concentrating energy into a focused beam. Possibility he described in language that shocked lay listeners. Whether one believes his claims to have designed defensive projects or thinks him a man miscast by imagination, the fact remains that his vocabulary suggested technologies of consequence. If a technology might change the balance of power, its creator becomes a strategic asset or a threat. Many who research this period see two plausible motives that might explain a staged death. The first is protection. Tesla believed his work would be stolen or misused. Disappearing may have been his only way to remove himself from being coerced. The second is coercion. State and corporate interests determined that his knowledge must be controlled. Manufacturing his death would be the simplest means of quieting a public fuss while preserving the inventor for classified purposes. Both hypotheses fit the behaviors recorded around his final days, and both imply a world in which knowledge can be a form of currency more lethal than any weapon. The accounts of men in dark suits arriving at the New Yorker carried the unmistakable tone of mid-century secrecy. These men were described by witnesses as serious and efficient, neither explaining nor offering condolences. They packed boxes with careful hands and left no time for ceremony. The presence of such operatives does not prove a conspiracy. It proves at least that the state considered the contents of that room worth handling with care beyond standard probate. Whatever they removed left behind a void only made more suspicious by the official insistence that there was nothing of value. Shortly after the confiscation, government scientist was asked to review the inventor's papers and file a public assessment. The conclusion offered to the world was bland. denying the existence of practical devices of immediate military value. To skeptics, that blandness was a deliberate recalibration intended to temper curiosity, while allowing other processes to continue away from public view. Historical cases of sensitive technology often include such reassuring verdicts published to the press, while the deeper analysis travels through classified corridors. Rumors gathered momentum in the months and years that followed. A handful of witnesses claimed to have seen a man resembling Tesla in places connected to cutting-edge experiments. Men working on military projects later spoke in guarded terms about ideas that echoed the language of wireless transmission and directed energy. Scholars of the clandestine point to an uneasy overlap between what Tesla described and what certain secret programs later explored. The overlap alone does not constitute proof, but it is the kind of pattern that will never satisfy someone who wants closure from mystery. The man himself had long framed his relationship with the world in almost religious terms. He believed that energy, frequency, and vibration underpinned reality. In private notes, he speculated on the capacity to manipulate these fundamentals, to alter the behavior of matter simply by adjusting resonance. He sometimes spoke of results that would be indistinguishable from magic to those who did not understand technical nuance. To a government that feared both enemies and public panic, a man who described such capabilities would be either an asset to harness or a risk to remove. An essential element in the conspiracy narrative is the disappearance of the physical artifacts. Blueprints, notebooks, and prototypes are the lifeblood of invention. The public inventory included documents, but witnesses and family members later claimed that certain trunks were never disclosed and that some files were missing from the catalog. If evidence vanished in haste, it is easy to wonder whether it vanished with intent. Objects rarely disappear without someone making the choice to remove them, and removal implies a decision about destiny, not an accident to fate. If Tesla had chosen to vanish, how might he have done it? Some researchers suggest he could have arranged for a decoy, someone to be found where history would expect to find him while he slipped away. Others imagine a negotiated agreement in which he would live quietly under new identity and conditions, acceptable to those who now determined the terms of his work. Both scenarios rely on the willingness of powerful actors to orchestrate or sanction the substitution. That such willingness might exist in wartime is not implausible to historians familiar with black budgets and classified laboratories. Another strain of thought argues that Tesla's death was the last public chapter of a life that then continued in a different form. In this view, the inventor was shepherded into secrecy and employed on projects that could not be acknowledged. He did not die so much as move into a compartment of state work where names were no longer relevant and attribution meaningless. Within such compartments, progress is slow, records are restricted, and credit is withheld. For an inventor who craved recognition in public, this would be both exile and imprisonment. Some of the most compelling stories come from the small human details. Hotel staff remember an odd hum from the suite in the hours before the discovery. A maid insisted she smelled ozone in the corridor. Another employee recalled seeing men with briefcases leaving in the small hours. Each recollection is mundane on its own, but together they form a texture of ordinary people witnessing an extraordinary removal from the world. That texture matters because disappearance is rarely a single theatrical act. It is instead a sequence of small procedural movements that add up to finality. The broader geopolitical context cannot be discounted. In 1943, the world was at war, and states were willing to take drastic measures to secure advantage. New technologies moved from laboratories to battlefields with extraordinary speed. In such an environment, an eccentric inventor with controversial claims about energy transmission and concentrated power would be an object of intense interest. Whether his work was as advanced as he claimed or merely promising enough to warrant attention, the calculus of wartime secrecy favors containment over open debate. What did the official records leave behind for the future to parse. A pile of documents, some legible and some cryptic, accounts that alternately mourn and diminish a once celebrated figure, and an absence that grew heavy with speculation over time. Historians reconstruct by triangulating archives, private letters, oral testimony, and the occasional memorandum. In Tesla's case, the triangulation produced more angles than answers. This asymmetry is what drew conspiracy attention. When public narratives are threadbare and official files incomplete, the human appetite for a fuller story compels us to imagine the missing pieces. There is also the question of motive in human terms. Why would Tesla himself choose disappearance if he did? The man had grown eccentric and entrepreneurial support had waned, but he still valued ideas and their transformation into a lasting impact. Disappearance could be a means of protecting his legacy from distortion, a way of setting his work beyond the reach of corporate profiteers. Conversely, if the state engineered his removal, the motive is clear in pragmatic terms. A government asked to choose between public frenzy and secret control of a promising technology will frequently choose the path that preserves strategic advantage. Stories that include staged deaths must also confront the practicalities of living in secret. A man who had been famous for decades would find anonymity costly. He would require resources, protection, and cooperation from those who could manage identity in a world of press, patent offices, and old acquaintances. That some organizations can supply such logistics is the reason these ideas are not pure fantasy. Throughout modern history, individuals with valuable knowledge have been embedded in classified projects under conditions that erase their former lives. There are also the residue phenomena that populate every enduring mystery. The anecdotal sightings, the half-remembered conversations, the references in later projects to ideas that echo earlier notebooks. Over the years, amateur investigators compiled lists of alleged sightings and loose connections to experimental programs. Scientists and military personnel who later worked on directed energy and high-frequency transmission sometimes used language that chimed with Tesla's earlier vocabulary. Again, this is not proof, but it is a set of parallels that invites inquiry rather than dismissiveness. If you accept for a moment that Tesla's disappearance may have been orchestrated, the consequences are paradoxical. On the one hand, a hidden continuation of his work could have accelerated certain technologies decades before the public knew. On the other hand, removing a public profit of open energy from the community of engineers may have slowed any broad democratization of his ideas. The result is a history in which private control of innovation replaces public debate, and where secrecy becomes the mother of myths about the inventor's fate. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the story is how neatly the myth of the absent inventor fits the temperament of the age. The mid-20th century was a time when many believed that technological progress would both save and destroy. Tesla's persona sat perfectly between the evangelist and the madman, the man who could give power to the people and yet whom the people could not safely be trusted to hear. In that paradox lies the kernel of motive for erasing a public face in favor of a secretive program. Conspiracy narratives satisfy an emotional hunger to attribute meaning to absence. When people see an emptied room, a sealed trunk, and a silent public response, they ask, who benefits? Those questions are not irrational. Power often consolidates behind closed doors, and secrecy allows easier appropriation of invention. Whether Tesla was a willing participant in his own removal or an object of state necessity, the moral that emerges is ugly but familiar. Extraordinary knowledge tends to attract extraordinary containment. Even if the truth of Tesla's fate never surfaces, the story endures because of its symbolic force. It is a cautionary tale about genius unprotected, about the ways institutions respond when the social order is threatened by novel ideas. It is also a reflection on the human tendency to shrink paradox into certainty. For some, the idea that Tesla slipped away into a hidden life is a romantic closure. For others, it is an indictment of the practical cruelty of systems that privilege control over conversation. The pieces of the record will likely never assemble into a single definitive account. Documents may remain classified for decades, private papers may have been lost, and the living witnesses have gone. All that remains are fragments, some official and some whispered, which together create an outline that will be filled differently by each reader. The outline, however, is enough to sustain speculation because it asks us to consider how much of modern power was shaped in rooms where cameras and public records did not reach. To look back on Tesla's last days is to look into a mirror in which the reflection is always one step out of sync. Whether he staged his death to escape a world he thought would misuse his ideas, whether he was removed by forces fearful of his potential, the vanishing itself has become the last machine he built. An absence engineered to alter behavior and attention. The man who made electricity visible ultimately made himself invisible to serve a purpose that we still debate. In the end, it seems fitting that the life of the man who spent decades tuning frequency and resonance should leave behind a lingering vibration. It is a vibration that sounds like a question rather than an answer. For those who studied the history of inventions and the shadows that follow them, Tesla's departure is less a termination than a migration of influence into places we rarely examine. The history of technology is full of such migrations, and the chilling uncertainty of this one is part of why his name continues to hum. What remains is a small bundle of facts in a much larger bundle of absence. We can read inventories and memoranda, interview the descendants of those who handled the crates, and follow redacted footnotes through stacks of bureaucratic paper. Or we can stand in the quiet of a hotel room and listen to the static. In that static, some still swear they hear the echo of a man who did not want to die in the ordinary sense. Whether that echo is scientific, spiritual, or simply the wishful projection of those who love mystery is itself part of the story. If the files that were removed that January morning ever resurface, they will tell a history that will change more than a few narratives about invention, power, and secrecy. Until then, the official version sits on record, while the private imagination fills the ledger with possibilities. In either case, the disappearance of Nikola Tesla remains a case study, not only in what we lost, but in how we handle knowledge that makes us uncomfortable.